The gospel lesson for today is from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 10. I should have prayed to God that my voice gets better by next Sunday, because this singing is like agony to me, not being able to sing. I also want to say to you, those of you who are singers, you have to step up, you know. When the pastor can't sing, you have to step up. And I know who you are out there. I hope you haven't gotten used to having some kind of a loud voice in front of you, because that's very important. The healing of blind Bartimaeus is the story from Mark. They came to Jericho, and Jesus and his disciples in a large crowd were leaving Jericho. Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." And many sternly ordered him to be quiet. But he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed Jesus on the way. Here ends the lesson. I want to share a story with you. As a matter of fact, it's a story I've read at a funeral now and then. And it's an important story, I think. It comes from the writings of Fred Craddock. Fred is a longtime preacher, a great preacher, as a matter of fact, taught at Emory University for many years, and is known as one of the world's great storytellers. And this is a story from his own time when he was a pastor in Georgia. He met a very desperate person one day, and it was in the hospital. It was a young woman, probably in her mid-30s, and when he encountered her, it was a very unusual encounter. Her head was against the door to the chapel in the hospital, and both fists were beside her face, and she was banging on the door. "Let me in, let me in, let me in." I couldn't imagine someone locking her out of the chapel. I got there, and the door was locked. I said, "Let me help you." I tried to open the door, but the knob wouldn't even turn. I stopped the worker and I said, "The chapel is locked." And she said, "Oh, we have to keep it locked. There were some kids in there some time ago, and they trashed the chapel. We had to get all new furniture and paint the room. We can't afford to keep doing that, so we keep it locked." "Well, find someone with a key." She came back a little later with another woman who opened the door for us, and this distraught woman and I went in. I would say she was less than 40 years old. She had the look of desperation. I could tell that she hadn't come to the hospital with any planning. She came urgently. She came running. The dress she had on was not typical public wear. She had no shoes, just scruffs on her feet. Her hair was not combed. She had on no makeup. She had the look of desperation. She had the voice of desperation. I can't tell you if she was screaming or crying or moaning or what it was, but it was desperation. Strange sound. I heard some of her words. She said, "I know he's going to die. I know he's going to die." "Who?" I asked. "My husband." "What's the matter?" "He had a heart attack." I said, "Can I get you some water?" She said, "No." I told her who I was, and I said, "Can I pray with you?" And she said, "Please." I started to pray for her and her husband, and she interrupted me. She didn't just interrupt me, she took over. She started praying herself and stopped my prayer. I think maybe I was too quiet or too slow or saying the wrong thing or something. Anyway, my prayer wasn't getting there, and she knew it. So she said, Lord, this is not the time to take my husband. You know that better than I do. He's not ready. He never prays. He never goes to church or anything. He's not ready. It's not a good time to take him. Don't take him now. And what about me, Lord? If I have to raise these kids, what am I going to do? I don't have any skills. I can't find work. I quit school to marry him. If I'd have known you were going to take him, I'd have stayed in school. She was really talking to God. And what about the kids? They don't mind me now with him around. If he's gone, they'll be wild as bucks. What about the kids? This is not the time to take my husband. Oof, I said. I stayed as long as I felt useful. I went back the next morning, and she had on a nice dress. She had on shoes. She had combed her hair. She looked really beautiful. She was in the hallway outside intensive care, and before I could ask, she said, he's better. She smiled and said, I'm sorry about that crazy woman yesterday. And I said, well, you weren't crazy. She said, I guess the Lord heard one of us. I said, he heard you. She was desperate. She had God by the lapels, both hands, and was screaming in God's face, I don't think you're listening. That's desperation. The picture of frustration, we all know what that looks like. The one who's next to you, near you, the ones you love the most, you've seen that desperation on their face at some time in your lives. Young kids get desperate and we get frustrated with them. When we get older, we're just about the same. Somebody who's desperate frustrates us. We don't want anybody to be desperate. Isn't that uncomfortable when you're around a desperate person? Because you don't know what to say. Situations like this in the hospital, what is there to say? I'm always amazed that when the pastor comes, people expect the pastor's going to say some miracle kind of words, and everybody's going to be calm and feel good. And that's one of the hardest things about ministry, because sometimes there are just no words, no matter how much training or experience you have. And you can picture this woman, can't you, praying? If you close your eyes and you put a picture of this woman in your mind's eye, you can see what it would be like. You can see her standing outside that door, pounding on the door, let me in. We want to go into some kind of sacred space. The chapel just represents that. The church is the same thing. When we feel we have to get closer to God, we want to go into some space that's special. And we feel a little closer to God, at least, in that special space. I feel sorry for folks who don't have those spaces in their life, especially people who've been treated badly by the church. And I've known many of those, and they won't come in because the memories are so awful for them. And yet for most of us, it's a very special space, and that's why she wanted to be in that chapel. And she was suffering. Did you ever hear a more suffering-filled prayer than that woman was praying? And there's one thing about all of us we have in common in that suffering. I could ask, how many of you have a house on the lake? Or a few hands would go up. How many of you have ever owned a convertible or own one now? A few hands would go up. How many of you ever played rugby? A couple of hands would go up. But I ask, how many of you have suffered or been close to suffering? And every hand goes up. We all know about suffering. It's the thing that really binds us together. And when we think about other people and we're afraid of their differences, maybe it would help if we think when they suffer, they're just like me. There's no difference at all in that suffering. It's what creates solidarity among all people. Jesus said early on in his ministry, in the world you will have tribulation. You will have tribulation. We've had more than tribulation, haven't we? Now, tribulation isn't even a big enough word for some of the things that we have suffered or seen others suffer. When I think of the kids I taught at the school for all those years and read their files, and I never read their files until after I got to know them a little bit, I didn't want to be tainted with the abuse and neglect that they had gone through, and that's why they were in this residential program. But the word tribulation didn't cover what had happened to them. And I think Jesus said it this way because there is no word to cover it. The pain and the loss and the myriad kinds of suffering that you and I have seen or felt ourselves in the world. And yet, every suffering is one characteristic or two characteristics in common, I should say. It's unique to us, but it's also very common. It's unique in the sense that it involves everything that we are. Like this woman that day in the hospital. There was nothing else in her life at that moment than what was going on in that hospital. Unique to her, but also common. Some of you have pretty near the same story. Doors close in our lives, and that causes a lot of this suffering. Doors close in every life. One of the things we want to teach our kids is that, sometimes the door is just closed. I was talking to a young person fairly close to me long ago, and she was complaining about not having the right job and not having enough money to buy a new car and all these other kinds of things. And I said to her, well, you're poor. It never dawned on her. You're poor. And that's why you can't afford these things. Some doors are closed, but not all of them. Now you have to decide what you're going to do about this. You're going to have to find some other doors that are open. There was a comedy thing on television one day, and the same thing was going on. It's a comedy show that the Tool Man is on. What was his name? Whatever it is. And his daughter was complaining, and he said to her, well, you're poor. Your mother and I are doing quite well, but you're poor. And that's the truth. Doors are closed. And they're closed in more serious ways than issues that have to do with money. But the other part of this is that God is a door opener. And to me, these are the key elements of faith. To be able to accept the fact that some doors are closed and to believe that God is a door opener. If those two things don't come together for us, I'm not sure that our faith is on any solid ground. Like the woman in the story. The door was closed, it seemed, and she went in and prayed. Now, in this story, her husband recovers. It's the kind of story we all want to have in our lives. But obviously, and you know this with your heart and soul, could have gone the other way. Many of us have experienced that kind of a door staying closed. A loved one dies, a relationship dies. Something about our dreams for the future die, and it's not going to be revived. And tribulation seems to be overwhelming. But we are told God is there. Regardless, God is still there. The old saying, seeing is believing, in terms of religious faith is flipped over. Because in religious faith, sometimes believing leads to seeing. Sometimes if we believe, then something happens, and we see something we didn't think could happen. So first the believing comes, and then the seeing. The blind man, for instance, was ready. He must have been thinking this kind of thing. He heard about Jesus. We don't know what he knew about Jesus. But when he sees Jesus go by, and he hears he doesn't see Jesus go by. When he hears about Jesus going by, then he hears what people are saying, and he knows about whatever he did know about Jesus. He jumps up and he yells, and he won't be quieted. The disciples did not understand his kind of frustration. Nobody could. Some of you are probably watching the Midwives series on PBS. In one of the latest episodes, the nurse These are nurses and midwives ministering to some of the poorest women in London in just terrible circumstances, tough circumstances. It's a wonderful series. And the nurse says to her, I can't imagine what's happening to you. That is a wonderful phrase for us to memorize, because sometimes what comes out of her mouth is, I know how you feel. No, we don't. In most cases, we don't. Unless the very same exact thing had happened to us. And even then, I'm not sure we really understand. The nurse says, I can't imagine what's happening to you. But she knows that this woman is suffering. And so that was the blind man. The disciples, as usual, are a little dense. They don't quite get it. But he jumps up. He is overcome by hope. And then hope gives him courage to come forward. And Jesus allows him to see. The other part of that tribulation verse from Jesus is, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. In that sense, he's telling us that we too can overcome. In fact, that's probably the number one thing on the job description as a person of faith, as a church person too. And we teach that to our children, don't we? We don't want our children to be defeated. One of the first things we want to teach our children to do is to be resilient, to come back, to get up after you fall. And there's a lot of images and a lot of stories about that. And it's been that way in our lives. Relationships breaking up and deaths and jobs ending and all kinds of other expectations that get crushed in our life. And then we say in our heart of hearts, it's time to pick myself up. And hopefully we have loved ones around us to lean on. Makes the task so much better. And we want to teach that to our children. And we admire overcomers. We admire people. I think about Zach. Zach was born without a complete leg. So as a little baby, and we can only imagine what Mark and Paula went through. As a little baby, they have to go through all this stuff about getting a prosthetic, and what's it going to be like when he grows up. And of course, the first thing that would come to my mind is, he's never going to be a Major League Baseball player, which was my dream, that was it. It's not going to happen for Zach. Now you look at Zach and you see the things he's done. And he's been down at NBC in New York. Is it NBC? Yeah. And all these things, he's becoming this media person. And we look at that kid, and I can remember playing church softball, and Zach was pitching for us, And he'd hit, bat, And there were a lot of people in that league. I could see them, and some of them I think even said this, but they didn't say it to our team. But we shouldn't let him bat. He can't run. What if he just swings a bat and then somebody else runs? Zach was going to run. That's it. That's all there was to it. This is an overcomer. Now, he knows he can't run fast, but he's in the game. That's the important thing. He wants to be in the game, and he wants to go as far as he can in that game. We admire people like that, and you know people like that. We tell the stories of people in our own families that have overcome difficult things in our family histories. Everyone has someone like that. And look around you in this room. It's not only Zach. There are overcomers in this room. Some of you have been through terrible things, awful things. I think about the trouble that the girls had growing up at the school, these emotionally disturbed kids. Some of you had growing up just like that. We all looked like we had wonderful parents, and life went on beautifully, and that isn't true at all. Some of it was terrible. So we know about pounding on the chapel door and crying out for God to have mercy. And quite frankly, as a church, we need to do the pounding on the door for those who are too weak or too hungry or too oppressed or too young or too old to pound on the door themselves. That's why we gather here. You need someone to pound on the door for you? We're here to pound on the door. That's in our job description. And we'll do whatever we have to do to pound on that door and get it open for those who need help. Jesus says to the blind man, you have to really pay attention to this. This is vintage Jesus. This is the perfect gospel story for us to understand. The blind man comes up to him. Now, obviously, in those days, everybody could see he was a blind man. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want from me?" Is that the stupidest question you ever heard? What do you want from me? You want 6 toes so you can swim better? You want me to somehow, get you some groceries? What else can I do for you? You need a new camel? I want to see. I want to see. Isn't it obvious? No. And that makes me think that what I want from God and what you want from God isn't always obvious to God. Because you and I have not gone deep enough into our own lives to ask for what we really want. And so Jesus says, "What do you want from me?" But he gave the man what he wanted. In the very depths of that man's heart, he asked for what he wanted, and God gave it to him. This is the love of God made manifest in a question. Do you want to know that God loves us? Because Jesus, representing God, says to the man, "What do you want from me?" It's not a distant question. It's a close question. It's a reaching out question. It's a question that's going to open some doors, and it's aimed right at this man's soul. What do you want from me? Amen.